let's jump into it and see where we go to from here. So, so firstly, I'm Ross Adams. I'm a program manager in the Microsoft Online group. And we're going to talk today about Office 365 and some of the identity and access solutions, so some different types of identities. We spend a lot of time talking about federation, ADFS, and those types of things. Let's continue on. So we're going to get sort of through the different options. So there's a couple of different options around identities within Office 365. We'll look at the features and architectures and compare the sort of different options together and the stepping stones that you can go through. We're going to drill a fair bit into how identity federation works. Actually what happens when you've got an identity federation solution and the way that you actually authenticate. We'll talk about some of the deployment scenarios around that, and then we'll have some time for questions. Feel free as I go through to ask questions. I'll probably try and answer sort of some of the common questions I have as I go through, but by all means, ask as we go. So let's just sort of have a look at what we've got here around Office 365. This is kind of updates from where we were previously. How many customers currently have sort of a trial account in Office 365 or an existing V1 account? Excellent, excellent. Okay, so we'll kind of move forward then. So password policy controls for those in the V1 system. We didn't have very many password. Well, we had none, was probably the right term. What we have now is we have better password policy accounts, so you can set not to expire. For those, there was a session earlier today around PowerShell. So with PowerShell to Office 365, you can set passwords never to expire. You can set complexity requirements and so on. We do single sign-on, so we call it identity federation, single sign-on, enterprise single sign-on, lots of words. They all mean pretty much the same thing. This is all about using your corporate credentials to log into the Office 365 services. There's been updates to directory synchronization, and Jono, who's sitting at the back of the room right now and whose laptop I happen to borrow, he's going to have a session tomorrow on that, and I reference it at the end. We also added some role-based administration. So we didn't have this previously. You're either a company admin or you weren't. We have a couple of different ones through now. Company admin, obviously, admin across everything. A billing admin, they're really about subscriptions and those types of activities. A user account admin, create, delete kind of accounts. Help desk can reset passwords, not create accounts. And then service support admin is really about getting partners to help you through. And that's kind of leads into that last bullet there where we still have the admin on behalf of. Works very similar for those who are partners. So let's just talk about how this looks actually from an architectural perspective. So what we have here is, if you like, we have Contoso. They live on premise. They have some users and they sit in AD. And we also have all the cloud infrastructure. So as I said, we got sort of the admin portal, which we've, you can come down to the booth and have a look at. I'm not going to show you today. And we have PowerShell. They talk to this sort of provisioning platform that talks to our directory. And we also have, within that sort of identity service that includes the directory store, we also have the authentication platform, okay, where it's the default location for our IDP, our identity provider. The federated services that live off the side, so Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Link Online, and Office subscription services, they all have a trust. These dotted lines represent trusts. So they're expecting that, regardless of how you get one, but you need a token that came from the authentication platform to be able to access those services. Okay. So the first sort of step is, as I said there, we got these sort of what we'll call Microsoft Online IDs. So this is completely cloud managed. You don't need any on-premise infrastructure. Very much username and password, if you will. And very similar to what we have in V1 today. Then what we add is we add Microsoft Online IDs, and this time we're going to add directory synchronization. And what directory synchronization does for us is basically gives us a link from your Active Directory up to the cloud. And it basically allows us to provision users across, not only into the directory store, but from the directory store up into the authentication platform, and then across to the federated services, okay, or the Office 365 services. And as I said, there is a session on directory sync that'll cover a lot more detail, and a follow-up again on Thursday by myself and Jono around that. So what we've got now is kind of still identities in the cloud, but now we've got sort of user management being on-premise. User group contact. From there we add single sign-on with directory synchronization. It's sort of, they're not mutually exclusive. We will recommend that all customers who want to do single sign-on will use directory sync as a means of provisioning those accounts. Single sign-on doesn't give us provisioning, so ADFS does not give us provisioning. We need that provisioning step to happen in order to be able to successfully authenticate into the cloud. Okay. And as you saw there, we've got this trust now. So there's this trust that we created between the authentication platform coming back to the ADFS server, so ADFS 2.0, must be 2.0. We only support ADFS today. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And you saw there the IDP, the identity provider, moved to on-premise. This is a very important step. Basically what that means is in order to be able to authenticate, you must be able to talk to your identity provider. In this case, you can't access your ADFS infrastructure or it can't access your AD. The users will not be able to log on to Office 365. Okay? Your dependency on that is that you have now a dependency on your own infrastructure to be able to actually authenticate. There's some pros and cons of that. So, as we said, just sort of a recap here, we have online identities, great for small organizations, no on-premise requirements, no service required for this. You don't get any single sign-on. You don't get any sort of two-factor authentication, no strong auth scenarios. If you have on-premise accounts, you will have two of them, one for the cloud and one for on-premise. They are not synchronized. The usernames and passwords will be different, potentially, unless you manually force them to be the same. And then, you know, everything's pretty much mastered. All your identities are mastered there. You create groups, users, contacts, everything in the cloud. When we add directory sync to that, we're really looking at sort of that medium to larger size organization. Users and groups and their properties. So their email address, SIP address, display name, all of those sorts of things are all managed on-premise now. They do flow across. We start to enable coexistence scenarios. So allowing you to have mailboxes on-premise and mailboxes in the cloud and have a level of coexistence so that you can send mail, get some sort of information between them. So they have a common GAL, for example. Again, no SSO, no strong auth options, still sort of falling back to the online IDs that don't support that. And potentially, it says two sets of credentials, it's like 1.5, if you will. 2 passwords, the username should be the same. All right. And there's a single server required for this. So this is the directory sync requirement to have that server on-premise. And it need not necessarily be highly available. If for some reason if it fails, it just means, you know, GAL, the viewable area of this is that the GAL gets out of sync. Okay. When we add here, we add federated identities or SSO identities with directory sync. We're really looking at sort of larger organizations. And that need not necessarily be true. There's nothing that stops you doing this in the smaller organizations. The same with directory sync. It's just the amount of infrastructure you need to be able to do this. What it does give you is single sign-on with your corporate credentials, which is probably the key area. One username, one password. The same username and password you have on-premise is the same in the cloud. All right, there is effectively no difference. IDs are mastered on-premise, so all of the users, properties, groups, display name are all mastered on-premise, as is all the password policies. So if you have a password policy that requires complicated passwords, passwords of long length, things that we don't support. So today, online identities only support 8 to 16 character password, numbers only, letters and numbers with some additional characters, but not space, no double quotes. So it's kind of an interesting way of describing a password. But yeah, no spaces, no password history other than the old password. So if you need more rigid control over passwords, Identity Federation is the way to do that. It does allow some levels of two-factor authentication. We'll go through those depending on the way that the clients connect. But you can start saying, I want external users that come from an internet kiosk to, you know, use RSA or some other form of two-factor authentication in order to be able to get onto the system. Okay. And it not only does it enable the coexistence, but it gives a much smoother coexistence experience. I've got the same username, same password. You know, I fire off an application, it just logs in. I get migrated, my mailbox gets migrated to the cloud. I restart, I type my regular username, password, and I'm in. Okay. The big con here, if you will, I was going to say every cloud has a silver lining. In this case, not so silver. It does require on-premise deployment of ADFS. And as I said, it's really important that that ADFS infrastructure is highly available. It must be able, you know, if it's not available, users won't be able to log in. So it does require that to be highly available and have a level of redundancy. So it's sort of minimum 2 servers, and we move from there. So the single sign-on experience, and we're going to sort of forget managed identities from now. They serve a purpose for the smaller organizations, and for certain types of accounts, your admin account should, at least one admin account should remain as a standard online identity. That way, if you have trouble with single sign-on, you have a means of reverting back or being able to manage the account separately. Okay, so it's important to have at least one admin that's not designated as a single sign-on admin. So what do I need to do this? So how do I get this wonderful experience we've all been talking about? There's a component now, we call it the Office 365 desktop setup. It is required for rich clients. In this instance, what it actually does is it installs a bunch of operating system patches, make sure that Outlook's patched to the right versions, and so on. It does some level of configuration, configuring the client. If you're moving from V1 to V2, this is that piece of software you need on the machines. It's not required if you've just got web apps. If you're only using web applications, you don't need it. Sorry, Okay, so what the question is, what kind of configuration does it do? It does a few things around setting up Outlook, creating the right profile for you. It also does similar things for Link, okay? Add some desktop shortcuts. A lot of these things that it does, you could do manually outside of the tool, all right? So things like installing the patches. If you're a large organization, you already have a means of installing patches, you can bypass this tool. So while we say it's required because it installs certain components. Specifically installs a sign-in assistant, which is required for Link. The Link client won't work with it. In fact, Link will say, hey, in order to log on, you need this particular component, and it'll tell you where to go and get it. So it is possible to bypass it. We're saying it's required because it's easy, but really what's required is the work that it does, and we will document that. Okay. So password prompts. Unfortunately, password prompts don't go away. There are some certain scenarios, and we're going to walk through this in a little bit more. For rich applications, specifically around Outlook, Outlook will prompt for credentials, okay? But it's possible to save those credentials. Now, it's the same username, same password. It's just it needs it in order to be able to do the authentication, and I'll explain why as I walk through how it actually authenticates, and then it'll become clear. The second one is for web applications. Basically, those applications, again, have a checkbox that sort of says, keep me signed in. Checking the keep me signed in box will keep you signed in, and you'll get no further prompts as you go from one Outlook or one IE session to Word, who also authenticates through web to SharePoint, to keep that going through. Similarly, the Link client is probably one of the better clients. Link does have an option to save your password if you're an online identity. In a true SSO, it's one of the first. It does a true SSO. So you fire off Link, Link logs in, no prompts, and no need to save a password. That's on a domain joined machine, and we'll walk through that in a bit. So how do we actually get past some of this? So my users, they don't necessarily know their username. They don't know it as a UPN, which is what's required. How do we get past that? We can use this concept called smart links, and I'll give you a demo of what a smart link actually does for us. And sort of compare the two as different. So we can use smart links, which allow us to get through without any password prompts or any username prompts. When we do prompt for a username, it's really important that users input a UPN. So most users log onto their machines today with Contoso/user, so Contoso/Ross. Excuse me. Look at that, there's a bottle of water. Contoso/ROS, but it doesn't necessarily, try one that's not open. Contoso/ROS, which is sort of the SAM account name. We need them to enter it as UPN format, so ros@contoso.com. And it's important that that happens, and this is for realm discovery, and you'll see how realm discovery plays into this, but it's important that users understand that prompting for passwords is, or usernames and passwords in SSO is around UPN, not user slash or domain slash user. Okay. Non-domain joined machines, unfortunately, will prompt just like they do today. If you try and access a corporate resource, they prompt for the credential. The same thing happens in Office 365. So from a summary perspective, that's better, we have kind of this matrix, and it's kind of hard to read, but it gives us a bit of a summary of where we are, and you can certainly look through here. What we have there is kind of the three boxes, if you will, and the three horizontal bars. We have online identities and what happens in there. So at each session across the various operating systems, so link online, if we take that sort of vertical slash through there, if we're talking about online identities, you will be prompted for a username and password. User has the option of saving it. If you're running SSO, you've set up Identity Federation, you will get no prompts. If it's non-domain joined machine, you will get a prompt. This time it's your corporate credentials you would put in. For Outlook, you will get a prompt on each session. You can save it. The difference being, one, you have to enter an online identity, and the second, you're entering your corporate credentials. Okay. Web applications, it says there are no prompts on domain joined machines. That's using smart links to get past that. If you do get a prompt, web applications are pretty good. If you get a prompt on a web application, enter your username, and I'll give you a demo of this. You enter your username, you don't have to enter a password. Once you enter your username, we'll decide that, hey, giving me your password's useless, I'll send you to somewhere that you can actually authenticate. Okay. And then we repeat Outlook, Office. Office applications actually authenticate in a web manner. So when we talk about Office, so we're talking about Word, Excel, PowerPoint, accessing a SharePoint site, they're actually authenticating through forms, forms-based authentication, which is similar to web. Okay. And then your very last one here is your ActiveSync, POP, IMAP, non-Microsoft email clients, telephones, those types of things. Those all require a sort of username and password setup, but again, you can save that as you go through. For SSO, you're entering your corporate credentials. So all the way through here, we're saying, the key thing here is that where you are prompted, you are either entering, for SSO, you are entering your corporate credential. So single sign-on, let's sort of walk through this, how we set it up, how we authenticate, flows, some lovely animation that I've worked on, some deployment scenarios, and then how would we roll this out? So here's my model I started with earlier. So there's a new component, as I said. Pardon me. We have PowerShell now in Office 365. It's called the Microsoft Online PowerShell module for Windows. We wanted to get something nice and short. So the first step is really to get that. So we create the company, and we like you to set up a federation before directory sync. So we go ahead and we say, there we go. We install that particular module, and then we say, using the commandlets, and I'm going to show you these commandlets, we go ahead and we say, great, I need to get an established connection across to Office 365, so I need to establish a link to the provisioning platform, and I also need to connect to your ADFS server. So ADFS server is basically a vanilla. You can use an existing ADFS server as long as it's 2.0. We'll make all the changes that are necessary on it, but assuming you've got a vanilla setup, basically we call add domain. All right, so there's a commandlet to do this. And what it'll do is it'll return back to you a record, a DNS entry that says, great, in order to prove you own this domain, go and do these steps. Okay. Once you've done that and you proved you own the domain, you call add again. And what we do there is a couple of things. First of all, we verify you own the domain. So we do that by making sure that from the cloud that we can find that DNS record you created. And if that all works, we go off and we talk to the ADFS server, and we add a couple of things to it. First of all, we add a bunch of claim rules to the relying party trust that we created. We also add an attribute or a claim extension called the user source ID. Now, the user source ID is kind of important. It's how we actually, and it's your AD object GUID that we store. It's how we tie all these things together. Okay? So when a user authenticates, what ends up happening is these claim rules will send this token, and within it, we'll have that user source ID. That user source ID is what we use to tie the user, the shadow user that we saw before that got created by Dersync, back together. Okay, so we use that source ID as that unique identifier for the user, so that when you arrive at the identity platform, we can do this transition and convert you from effectively to what the shadow user is in the cloud, so that the federated services know who you are. Okay. So once that occurs, we send all that information up to the cloud, and the trust is now established. So really, it literally takes about that long. If I don't talk, it actually is faster. To add a federated domain takes about that long. And what I'm going to do is I'll show you a demo of actually, we're going to remove the trust and then we'll recreate it. So it's about a 5-minute operation once you've got ADFS deployed. Unfortunately, ADFS is a more complicated deployment. So we'll have just a little sort of talk about, this is some of the command lines that we offer. So we sort of saw add there, where we can add a subdomain for a single sign-on or add a root domain, okay? And we can also convert a domain. So for 9x, for customers on the current system, when they move across, they're going to go across as standard online identities, or what we'll call a managed domain or a standard domain. What we can do is we can convert from that standard domain across to single sign-on. So we can convert. It's a one-step operation. It's a big button, and the entire organization is converted in that way. The second thing we can also do is we can obviously convert back. Okay, so we can go from a federated domain back to a standard domain. Okay, should be used with caution. All right. The reason I say that is if any of the users have logged on and been converted to federated accounts, their password in the process is lost. So when a user becomes fully federated, their password is lost. And if their password was lost, when they get converted back, they must get a new password. We will tell you what it is, but we walk through every single user in Active Directory, and we try and convert that user back to being a standard user. And on that conversion, we check, is the user currently federated or are they managed? If they're currently federated, we give them a new password when we convert them back. So really, converting from single sign-on to standard is not sort of oh, I've got a bit of a problem with my ADFS server. I'll just convert back to a regular domain, and then while I fix my ADFS server, it isn't going to be a workable solution for you. Okay. You can also get properties, really good for troubleshooting. It'll tell you what the certificate is that's used to do token signing, branding IDs, URLs, those sorts of things from both the ADFS server perspective as well as Office 365. So you can make sure you've got everything set up the way you need it. And then, of course, if there is a disparity, you can run update. I'm going to show you update. In fact, I think my demo is next. It is. So let's switch over here and have a look. Okay. Oh, I'm going to do it from here. Keyboard and a mouse and a bit of water. Apparently not. Only apparently a keyboard, no mouse. Okay. So first of all, let's look at ADFS. So what we have here is pretty much, as I said before, we've got kind of ADFS that's been installed on this box. We created a relying party trust there. You've got Office 365 with the identity platform. And in here we added the claim identifier for this one. Excuse me. The source user ID. It's an important one. This is the attribute that we pass up for the immutable ID. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Oh, I'll show you. We had two claim rules. I won't really cover them off. We probably shouldn't modify them. If you do, it can create other problems. So I'm going to basically go ahead and delete this. simulate a nice failure. All right, there we go. And then I'm going to start up our PowerShell. Okay, so here we are. We've got our online services module for Windows PowerShell. Change its name. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to connect across to the online services. It's asking me for a user. And I said this is one of the reasons that we really want to keep a managed user account around that's an admin, so that in the event that a failure, so basically my clients can't log on anymore because I just deleted the relying party trust. In this instance, everybody would be down, so I need to make sure that I can actually log into the Office 365 without having without using a federated account. So, and I'm actually using our eDog system. That's why it says CCS CTP. But oh, excuse me, choking to death here. So I've connected there. I'm going to now connect to the ADFS server. If I can remember the commandlet. Come on, send. Well, there we go. I don't know what I was typing wrong. So that's my ADFS server. So now I've got a connection. No need to prompt there. We use integrated credentials across to it. We will prompt if it fails, so you can use different credentials if need be, if you have split roles in the way that you deal with your ADFS environment. And now I can sort of, from here, because I've got an existing domain, I'm going to say, go ahead and update my federated domain. I'm going to give it my domain name, which was tr12. And that's basically going through it saying, hey, I see you're a federated domain. I see you're verified. I'm going to go and look at ADFS. See there's no trust. Better go and recreate that, set all the claim rules on it. And if I come back into here and refresh this view, my claim rules come back. My relying party's back. So we get a lot of questions about redundancy and how do we deal with redundancy. And we will come out with a paper on this shortly. It's our next thing to do. However, in a lot of cases, redundancy is, it's a little different than AD. If all your AD servers disappear, you've got about 15 minutes before everybody decides they've had enough and users start getting prompts and other particular issues appear. With ADFS and Office 365, there's a little bit longer windows. It depends on some of the settings that you have configured, what the users are attempting to do. But there is a longer window of time before they actually get reprompted to enter credentials or need to re-authenticate. And that might be from 20 minutes to an hour or so. So in this instance, if I had a hot standby and it was using the same certificates, I could probably, well, a cold standby or a warm standby, if you will, in another data center, I could fire it up, I could run this commandlet to update, and I would be back in business again. So, redundancy or geo-redundancy is pretty good for ADFS, and it's a little different between ADFS and what you would do for Office 365.
Can I register several independent ADFS servers to the Office 365?
Independent, can I have...
Without clustering, without any knowledge of each other?
No. The reason I say no. So the question... Yeah, so let me see if I've got the question right, and then I'll explain why I say no. So the question is, can I have several ADFS servers independent of each other without any clustering talking to Office 365? Yeah? Okay. And the answer I said was no. Okay. And there's a key reason I say no. Now, as far as ADFS goes, let's first of all just solve the clustering problem. ADFS doesn't actually require clustering. What it requires is load balancing, network load balancing, okay? And the reason it needs that is this little puppy here, okay, this one here, the token signing certificate. So when a token arrives at the authentication platform, it's verified by its signature, okay? So this, whatever I use, and by default we recommend using the self-signed certs. They roll over nice and easy, nice and manageable. Using different token signing certs will result in failure, all right? So what we require is really saying, I need at least two. They should be load balanced, not necessarily clustered. And it's the reason is so that the same token signing cert is sent. All right. So it's more like trying to load balance a web application than it is trying to load balance something like SQL. Okay. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So I'll just show you the get commandlet while we're here. It's a really good question. A lot of people ask that. And the answer is, again, unfortunately, no. Can we have them geographically dispersed? And no is the short answer. The longer answer is that, by default, you're using what they call the WID database within ADFS. So the Windows is integrated database, okay? And it doesn't handle high latency very well. So in this instance, a slightly different one, but we'll get back to you in a second. So if you're using WID, which we would recommend for most customers, it doesn't handle that high latency links very well. All right, you're probably better off. And if you're trying to do it to sort of say, well, I've got an office in the US and an office in the UK, and having all of the people in the UK authenticate against the servers in the US, that's for sort of geo load balancing. Again, it's sort of a web protocol, and we'll walk through it. And a lot of this happens behind the scenes for the user. And they're usually, the protocol itself, the way that the user authenticates, is relatively good across low latency links. So we're not going to probably recommend that for geo redundancy or geo load balancing that you need it with Office 365. Okay. The question around, or the statement around SQL clustering, is required if you move to a SQL cluster as the back-end store. Now, that's how ADFS would generally recommend you do geo-redundancy, is that you would have SQL and do SQL replication between them. It's a very expensive option, and for Office 365, we feel like it's probably better to keep a warm standby, run tools to update the Office 365, recreate the trust on the additional server, and just be with it and move forward. Okay. Let's try this again. Oh, I have to give it a domain name. Sorry, my mistake. Right, and what you can see here is, excuse me, I'm struggling a bit here, is basically the parameters. And you can see here it says these ones are the ones that came from Office 365. And up here you can see the on-premise parameters, and you can, from the ADFS server, and you can make a comparison between these two to say, hey, these all look in sync, or if they don't look in sync, run update to make sure that they are in sync. And you can, I don't have it, but you can look at things like the next signing certificate. So you can support failover of certificates within the cloud without any issue. Okay. So that one is get. I should really remember these, shouldn't I? All right. So, let me hit another button. There we go. So that was kind of the federation tool. So how does this actually work? How does the wonders of ADFS, what actually happens when a user tries to log on? So I'll pick the easy flow first. There's 3 of them. But this is kind of the easy flow. So the easy flow here is for web-based applications. This is users sitting on a domain-joined machine. They're going to try and go to Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, one of the web-based apps. What actually happens to them? So the first thing they do is they hit the Exchange Online service, and it says, hey, you've got to authenticate, and it returns a URL. That URL takes it across to the authentication platform. When it hits the authentication platform, they get a, if they're not using a smart link, in this case we'll assume they are, but one way or the other, the authentication platform takes the domain they typed in and says, hey, in order to authenticate with me, you've got to go and authenticate with this other URL. And it returns another URL to the client. The client then follows that URL. In this case, it hits the ADFS server. Okay? When they hit the ADFS server will challenge them to authenticate, probably with NTLM or Kerberos. In the client, if it's a domain-joined machine, will send through the NTLM token. The ADFS server authenticates that and performs a lookup. That lookup does a couple of things. One is it creates a login token that has the user's UPN in it, their user principal name. So user@contoso.com, and it has also their source user ID. Okay, this is their immutable ID. This is this thing that allows us to do this flipping with shadows. It's also provisioned by DirSync. Okay. So they get this token back. The client says, great, got that token. Embedded in the old URL was where they have to go back to, so they send it off to the authentication platform again. The authentication platform verifies the signature of the token. Okay, that matches up. The authentication token goes away and gets converted to an auth token. And this is what the federated service is looking for, this authentication token. And within it, it contains a user principal name and a unique identifier from the authentication platform that the federated services know about. It comes back to the client machine, and finally they send it off to the Exchange Online service or SharePoint Online, and they authenticate, and they're returned into OA. I have a slide on that, so we'll come to that one. And the short answer is no, but let me get to it. Okay. Everybody wants shibboleth. So here we are. So he finishes up. Now, let's talk about what we'll call the rich client. So this is how Link authenticates, all right? There's a MEX, the metadata exchange endpoint. There's sort of these three endpoints, a passive endpoint that we just looked at. This one, the MEX, metadata exchange endpoint or rich client endpoint. And then finally, we'll talk about the active endpoint. So in this case, users sitting there on their machine, Control-Alt-Delete, they log into their machine. What happens after they log onto their machine is this sign-in assistant. So we have this sign-in assistant running, and it says, great, I know, I've already gone off, I've got your UPN, I've looked it up, so I don't have to log onto the machine using UPN. I can log in domain/user on my workstation. From there, the sign-in assistant looks in AD and confirms from the token that came back my UPN. It grabs the domain of that, sends it off to the authentication platform. And the authentication platform in this case says, oh, I know you. You need to go to this ADFS server, and sends back the URL. The sign-in assistant follows that URL up to the ADFS server, who challenges it to authenticate, sends it a Kerberos ticket or an NTLM token, gets back the login token. Oh, yep, that's what we call it. The login token, which is a SAML11 token for those interested, containing those two properties. That comes back to the client machine. It then says, great, sends it up to the authentication platform, who converts it to, converts it to an auth token and brings it back. My little clicker's not working for me. Brings it back to the client machine. And this happens at login, okay? The client didn't see any of this. They don't know what's happening. The end user is oblivious to this. Then they start off Link, okay? When they start Link goes off to the Link Online service and says, hey, I need a token. You've got to authenticate with me. Sends it back. Client says, no drama. I have one of those, and sends it along, okay? So what we did was the same ping-pong operations that we had before, back and forth. However, in this case, because the sign-in assistant is running on the machines, it's actually done the back and forth. It actually has the token for you. All right?
Is the authentication platform similar or identical to the SharePoint service?
That's an interesting question. So SharePoint, are you talking SharePoint on-premise?
Yes.
So SharePoint on-premise does support a token-based authentication. This is similar in the way that it functions, but it's completely different in the way that the authentication platform is completely different. It is, but the back end behind that web service is significantly different. Okay. All right. So now we have the active client. So this is really, again, this is somebody using Outlook, and you'll see why it's really important that we have UPN in a second. So in this case, they log in, and the sign-in assistant would do its ping-pong thing. Doesn't really help in this case. What happens is when the user fires off Outlook, they shoot across to Exchange Online. They bounce back. Exchange Online said to him, hey, you need to authenticate. And this time it said, you need to authenticate with basic credentials. Okay, so basic over SSL. So the user gets a prompt, they can save this, but they've got to type in username @domain. Okay, it's very important, and you'll see why in a second. So they send this across to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online does what we call proxy auth. Okay, so what it does is it creates a little shadow representation of you, and it takes that domain that came in the basic auth request, and it sends it off to the authentication platform. And the authentication platform says, I actually can't authenticate you. You must go to this ADFS server. So what it does is it takes the basic credentials you gave it, and it sends it to the active endpoint of your ADFS server. When it hits your ADFS server, that active endpoint expects basic credentials. It has a set of basic credentials, and it basically converts that, logs in, does the lookup inside AD, and converts it to a login token with those two properties, always the two properties. Those come back to Exchange Online. It does a quick little ping pong up to the authentication platform, passing those two. It gets back its authentication token, comes back to Exchange Online. Now Exchange Online has the ability to look you up. It knows who you are. It knows where your mailbox is. And then eventually the little shadow guy goes away, and the user gets back their mailbox. Okay, so the active endpoint is being used in this instance for all types of, whenever Outlook is being used. So Outlook does this proxy auth. It's the same process that your phone uses. So mobile phones, Active Sync is using that same process. It's basic auth over SSL, and Exchange does the ping pong work, okay, for the client. So now we're going to get a demo of SSO in action. So here we were before. Now I just got to find my other machine, and it's this one. Oh, no, not that one. You just saw Jono's demo. Okay, so here I have a client. I'm going to do sort of the straightforward one. So I have a link here for OA. If I double click on that link, you'll actually see it swap. Now I'm at the point, and it's a little hard to watch, but effectively what I did there was I went to Outlook. Outlook returns in that smart link. Basically, when I gave it the smart link, I told it the realm. I told it, hey, I'm from Contoso. Or actually, I told it I'm from my little TechReady 12 company, TR12 company. And when I said that, it said, great. It told the identity platform. The identity platform said, you need to authenticate in ADFS. I got sent to ADFS. So I'm on a domain join machine. I sent my credentials across to that domain join machine, got back my token, and I log in. So from my perspective, I didn't see any prompts for username, no prompts for password. And I'm pretty much straight in. So I'll sign out here. There I am. I signed out of ADFS, and I can end up back where I was. Okay. So let's do the portal. The portal's a much more complicated smart link. In this case, my portal, when I actually click on this smart link, it's actually directing me direct to ADFS. So it's got the two URLs redirections embedded in it. All right, and we have information about how to create these smart links. It's not rocket science to create these smart links, but effectively this smart link, if I show you, has embedded in it effectively all of the bits and pieces to get back and forth. And if I could find the home key, come back here. And it tells it to go to my ADFS server direct. So I cut out a few hops. I didn't have to figure out two different hops. I just went direct there. Okay. But the net effect is the same. I end up logging directly into my client, and I'm here. Okay. So smart links make things much easier to use than if you don't. Now, I can't show you Outlook, unfortunately, on this machine. The reason being is it doesn't have a corporate, it's on my corporate environment. It doesn't actually have a way for Exchange Online to reach back to it. Okay? So it's really important that when you set up ADFS, which we're going to talk about immediately following this, when you set up ADFS, that you have an external connection in so that Outlook clients can connect. Okay? So, talk about that in a second. Just some details. So somebody asked about SAML P, sorry. So we got there SAML P, that's support with Shibboleth and those types of things. This is SAML 2.0 type stuff coming later. As it stands today, we need a WS Trust setup. So this is the WS Star protocol. The reason is it provides support for rich clients. So SAML doesn't, by SAML 2 within the standard doesn't actually support the ability for us to negotiate, if you will, an endpoint to authenticate with. Now, when I authenticate, when link fires off, it actually hits that metadata exchange endpoint. That metadata exchange endpoint lists all the endpoints that ADFS has available, and it basically picks the Windows Transport one so that it can send the, a Kerberos ticket or an NTLM token to it. SAML-P, while we will try and support it, won't necessarily support rich clients. Now, Outlook may be the exception because it doesn't actually require the MEX endpoint. It's using active endpoint. So we'll probably only publish two, passive and active, on for SAML-P setups. Yeah, so there are some papers that talk about it. And ADFS, we're talking here ADFS 2.0 for Office 365. ADFS does support SAML 2.0. There's no reason you can't use it to do SAML 2.0 for other applications as well as Office 365. At Microsoft, we have some 500 odd trusts. One of them is ours, and the rest are, for all sorts of things. So yeah, you could definitely use ADFS for SAML 2 or SAML-P. Strong authentication, got a couple of different options there. I'm going to talk about this a bit more, but really two-factor authentication is possible for a limited set of scenarios, predominantly around web apps. Is much easier to deal with, and you can use either the ADFS proxy and modify that sign-in page, or you can use TMG, UAG, who come with richer sets of two-factor authentication out of the box. And then rich clients, it's kind of complicated. We'll talk about that one in a minute. So, deploying ADFS. And this, we have one slide on this very complicated subject. There's documentation. If you get into the community website, under wikis, enterprise single sign-on, there's a document in there. It says new deployment, plan and deploy, step 2 of our kind of configuration, plan and deploy. There's new documentation in there, which is much better than it was in the first set of beta. It's much better than it is now in the current beta, and it's really what we use for general availability. Lots of work there with the ADFS team. So I'd suggest ignore step 2 in the portal and go straight to the document in the community site. So we can do a single server, not recommended, great for testing. You can also deploy a single server as a farm and then add another server to it later. If you're small enough, if you're sort of less than 1,000 users, you could use existing AD infrastructure to do it. Okay, it's not recommended that you put the load balancer NLB on the ADFS server. You'll probably have to pick another box for that. But you can deploy ADFS on top of AD. It's not true for DirSync, but it's true for ADFS. Okay. It must, though, be Windows 2008 or above. So your AD either is Windows 2008 or above, or you have some other boxes which are 2008 and above. Pardon me. So suggestion is deploy a farm, 2 servers in the farm, connected to your Active Directory, some sort of load balancer in front of them. You will need it for internal. So internal clients will talk to it for passive, as well as Link. Link talks to the internal servers. Externally, you're going to need to deploy 1 or 2 servers. You can use existing reverse proxy servers. So if you have existing ISA TMG servers out there, you can use those to publish the endpoints internally. Okay, so you need not deploy additional ones. Again, load balanced through. And you're going to need that for, as it says, our external users, Active Sync, and probably more importantly, those who want to run Outlook. Okay, if you don't deploy it for, if you only have Link online, and you don't deploy a proxy server, users will only be able to use it on the corporate network, or if they VPN in. Okay. So really, what do you need to do to prepare? Okay, and I have a much more detailed talk about this Thursday afternoon. I should write it down. Sim 320 is the name of it. It's Thursday afternoon around 3 o'clock. Much more detailed talk about how to prepare for AD. prepare your AD for this, but this is kind of the high level. You've got to have a high availability of your ADFS. There's really no two ways about it. If your ADFS isn't there, you won't be able to log in. Every user must have a UPN. Whilst we will do some magical stuff to try and figure out what their UPN is, that magic is not always bulletproof. It's great to set every user with a UPN. So this includes, making sure that the user knows what it is. We'll be able to guess it, perhaps. It matches their primary SMTP. Their primary SMTP address. But we should really go ahead and set that. The UPN suffix. So there's a lot of talk. So within AD, I can have contoso.local. I could be sub.contoso.com. As long as you can verify the ownership of that domain, you're good. All right. If you're contoso.local, not so good. We'll talk about that in a minute. UPN character restrictions. We love character restrictions. We've got them on passwords. They're even worse when we come to UPNs. We only really support letters, AE through Z, numbers, dot, dash, and underscore. Okay? And no dot before the @ symbol. So you can have ross.adams, that's fine, no problem with that. But you can't have ross.adams.junior.@contoso.com. Okay? We also have a short length. Domain names must be 48 characters. Usernames can be 64 for a total of 113. Okay? And then, as I said, the users need to understand that if they get prompted for their username and password, or for their, just for their username, they must enter their UPN. They can't log in using domain/user. Okay? So a little bit of user education there to get this all to work nice and smooth. Again, smart links are a good investment. You can also do CNAMEs to smart links. So you could set up a CNAME for, or a URL redirection if you wished, for mail.contoso.com and have that auto redirect to the right smart link so that they get in. And similarly, you could have, sharepoint.contoso.com, okay, and redirect to the right smart link. So how can we deploy this stuff? It's all good. It's what I want to do. How do we actually move it forward? Couple of points here. One is that domain conversion. When I convert a domain from either managed to federated to use with SSO, or from SSO back to managed, that conversion is a one-step operation. It's a big switch. There is no hybrid version of it. I can't say, I want to move my IT department, all members of contoso.com, I'm going to take my IT department and make them go ahead and use identity federation and make sure it all works, and then slowly move people forward. I can't do that. The only way to do it is, once I flip contoso.com to a federated domain, everybody must use federated credentials to log in. There's no sort of mixing and matching. So there's a couple of ways you can overcome this. One is do a staged rollout. So if you find that you're planning to move to identity federation, it's the right way to go, set it up first. Set up identity federation, sync the company in, take your IT department and give them licenses. Let them make sure that all the scenarios work. They can, continue to use, we make sure they can log on externally with all the different devices, get the user documentation updated, whatever it happens to be, and then start licensing new users into it. So it's a kind of staging the rollout by staging out how I give out licenses. And if you're doing sort of mailbox migrations with this, it's a really good way to go. Rather than start with usernames and passwords and then flip later. It's just safer if you've got the option to sort of stage it by licensing. Alternatively, you can sort of try and pilot federation. So if you're a V1 existing customer, you were migrated across to a managed domain, and you want to make sure that your ADFS infrastructure is correct before you move forward, all my scenarios work, all of those sorts of things. What you can do is you can create a new test domain. Now, it can't be a subdomain. So we will, if you're sub.contoso.com and you federate contoso.com, we will also federate sub.contoso.com. All the subdomains are federated automatically at the same time. So create a new one, test, ADFS, Contoso, whatever it happens to be. A completely new domain. Go on-premise, use it, you can create, or you can do it a couple of ways. You can directly edit the objects and change their UPNs to be in that new domain, or you can add an alternative UPN suffix And we have some documentation about this also on the community site around adding those alternative UPN suffixes. So once you do that and the user directory sync will fire off, it'll migrate the user direct across. So it'll move the user into a federated namespace and they'll start logging in with that federated experience. When you do that, make sure you set up ADFS just like you were going to for the real thing. So while we've created a test.contosa.com, say for example, set your ADFS server up as if it was the real one. So set it up in contosa.com, get it all through. This allows you to, when you want to move back and then convert to federated for everybody else, you don't have to touch ADFS. You know it's working. Everything was the way it should be. When you're reverting these users back, so you've gone through your testing, you've made sure everything works, and now I want to revert back so that I can convert contosa.com, get all my users using it, I've got to move through a managed domain. So these users, unfortunately, need to come back to contosa.com. They'll get new passwords. Okay, make sure they've got their password, then convert contosa.com. All right, and then they'll be okay. We currently don't support moving a user from one federated domain to another. Okay, now you can move between subdomains, so you can go from sub.contosa.com to sub2.contosa.com or to contosa.com, but you can't go from fabricam.com, the federated domain, to contosa.com, the federated domain. You must move through a managed domain. Okay, so a limitation we have currently. Okay. Again, Thursday we talk a little bit more about this. Hey. Okay, so there's a couple of different structures you can have or naming conventions that you can have for your on-premise server. So matching domains, really easy. This is just Ross's terminology, if you will. We call it matching domains. So you've got the same internal and external domain. You call yourself contosa.com, emails are contosa.com, UPNs are contosa.com. Everything's great. Nothing you need to do. This is an ideal situation. Subdomains. So I set up, Microsoft is a huge subdomain. We have hundreds of them, but we're corp.microsoft.com. Okay, and that's fine. You can be corp.microsoft.com or corp.contosa.com. This works. The only thing to do here is to make sure you register contosa.com first and then corp.contosa.com afterwards. Okay? Once you verify you own contosa.com, you don't have to verify you own all of the subdomains. We'll automatically assume that you do. Okay? So corp.contosa.com becomes very easy to add. Federate contosa.com and corp.contosa.com is automatically federated. Okay? So it's only an ordering thing there. If you have a domain that is sort of like .local, .not on the internet, routable, something like contosa.local, you do have a problem. All right? Or if you're an SLD, a single level domain, which we currently don't have a story for, but it's something that we're looking at. But effectively, a domain name that can't be proved ownership or is not routable on the web. Okay? In this case, everybody needs to get a new UPN suffix. You don't need to rename your AD. Okay? All you need is a new UPN suffix. Okay? So best advice would be take primary SMTP, which is probably contosa.com, and set that as their UPN. Okay? And then tell everyone, use your email address, use your email address. It's easy for them to remember. All right? So in this instance, you're going to have to set it up. Some considerations are smart cards. Smart cards are generally tied to UPN. So if you have smart cards and .local, you've probably got some work in front of you. Okay? And then you can have a mix of distinct UPN suffixes in a single forest. So you might have acquisitions and mergers and you've been bringing people in, or you've just got basically a bunch of users that operate as sort of different entities within the same sort of holding forest. So I've got contosa.com, I've got fabricam.com, which are distinct UPN suffixes. Today, we tell you you need to support one ADFS server per namespace, all right, or per domain. We're currently working to verify a fix for that. We have a fix for that, and shortly, after we have general availability, we've been able to verify that fix further. That requirement will go away, and you'll be able to use a single ADFS server to be able to support multiple UPN suffixes. Okay, so if you can, start with one UPN suffix. We will give you a way of moving to multiple UPN suffixes without too much hard work, and then you'll be able to use that single server to be able to support the rest of the organization. So multi-forest, a lot of people are going to ask me about multi-forest. I would like to take those questions offline if possible. Right now we don't support it. We understand the ask from it. We have a few V1 customers who are multi-forest who have done some interesting things that we will try and support as part of the migration. If you fall into that boat, please come and see me, and Jono at the back there. But right now it's not something that we support. It is on the plans. I just don't have a timeline for you. Okay? But I'd be interested in the scenarios you have around multi-forest. So strong authentication. And I call it, I've changed its name here, strong authentication, two-factor authentication, those types of things. We currently support two scenarios. So I said that last bullet point there, web applications. Great passive endpoint, really easy to do, web applications. Rich applications, so signing into the desktop. So something like Link, where I sign into my desktop using something like my smart card. So I log in using my smart card to my desktop. It's a requirement. AD is set. It's got the tick box that says must log in using smart card. I can support that scenario as long as once I've got a token, so once I've logged in with my smart card to my corporate machine, now I don't need to use it again. I can effectively request tickets or Kerberos tickets for additional connections to additional servers without re-authenticating. In that scenario, I can support Link. I can't support Outlook or any of the other, well, effectively, there's only two sort of rich apps, but I can't support I can support the Link client, but not Outlook. All right, and that's kind of why it says down the bottom here, for if you have that sort of must log in with smart card, or I must provide 2FA to get onto my corporate machine. Once on my corporate machine, I can get additional tickets without any further prompts for 2FA. Then I can support Link, but I can't support Outlook. And that's because Outlook's using basic auth, okay? Username and password. So it's really hard to get username and password and 2FA to work together, okay? Web applications, again, you can control this on an endpoint basis if you like. So you could say, if you're coming in from an internet kiosk or you're coming in through the externally and you're using a web app, I want you to give me two-factor authentication, okay? So you can mix and match a little bit in this scenario, and we can talk more about that offline. Mobile, again, the answer is no because it's using basic auth. That's a very good question. So is there a team in Outlook who are trying to fix this problem for us? And the answer is yes. We are working towards providing a better experience with Outlook, okay? Effectively a similar experience than what you would get out of Link, okay? But there's some challenges with that. I don't have timeframes for when that'll be released, but it's definitely something that we've got as feedback, especially around the support for strong authentication. So it is something we are looking towards. It'll probably be only on Windows 7 and above, but it is something that we are trying to fix. I just don't have a timeline. Mobile phones is probably unlikely. We have heard that as feedback, that mobile phones need some sort of stronger authentication. And the problem with a mobile phone is that mobile phones are kind of dumb devices. They don't support a lot of protocols. In fact, some of them don't support NTLM. Okay, they only support basic auth. That limits our ability. We are looking and potentially looking at, using CERT authentication, but CERT authentication also has its challenges because of the way the device authenticates. So it's feedback, and if you've got a particular scenario around it, I'd be interested to hear it afterwards. So proxies. We talk about the ADFS proxy. You're definitely going to need one in your environment. If you have Outlook and Exchange Online, you definitely need one. It's kind of a no-brains operation. There's a couple of different options, okay? We have there, so really rich apps, so without strong authentication, that's fine. Web apps with strong authentication, look, you get to using the ADFS proxy. The ADFS proxy sort of comes out of the box. You can do forms-based auth, but it doesn't come built in with an array of sort of smart, RSA or other types of strong authentication options. Forefront has a particular set, UAG has a richer set, but in order to use something like Forefront or UAG, you must publish each endpoint individually. Okay, so if you want web clients to have strong authentication when they come in, you must publish that endpoint separately. Okay, you can't. So Forefront UAG SP1 does have sort of like an ADFS proxy plugin. You can't use it natively. You have to actually support it, flipping and basically do the URLs. This URL goes here. This URL goes there. All right. So URL publishing. All right. But any of these options work. Again, the community site talks about how to actually set these up. We have some challenges such as we double encode URLs. Most reverse proxies don't like that. So if you do use something else, you've got to make sure you can bypass that particular check. So there's a bunch of links in here. The best one is to sign up for the beta. They're in the middle of the screen there, Office 365. Oh, well, the service descriptions will tell you what we can do. But there is a beta if you go to office365.com. You can get there. Once you get there, do look at the community site. It does give us good access to find out what you're asking, and we do try and get answers to questions in there. Jumpstart. Let's keep going. I'm trying to get to the. Okay. So I highlighted a couple of sessions. So tomorrow at 3:15, we have the directory sync session by Jono at the back there. It's probably a good one if you're thinking about using directory sync. A lot of detail. We have an interactive follow-up to this session, which both John and I'll try and be at, or I certainly will be there. 10:15 on Thursday morning. If you've got particular deployment questions, we're just going to whiteboard it out, so we'll have at it at that session. And then there's also another session which I'm running, SIM 320, and it's Thursday afternoon, and it'll go a lot more deeper into how we use identity federation and directory sync. I think it's called Office 365 Connecting AD to Office 365, something along those lines. Apparently I have another slide of other sessions, which is interesting. And here we are at questions. So, fire. Okay, so I think we're talking about sort of stepping stones. So we start with sort of online identities, which have got a separate username and password. We do directory sync, and then we've got kind of the top level where we say use directory sync and do federated authentication. And there seems to be a gap in the middle, as you've correctly highlighted for me, and that's around password sync. So I don't want to do ADFS. It's a bit too much for me, but having two passwords is kind of complicated for my users. So if they could just have one, it'd be really good. It's definitely something we've thought about. We've thought, predominantly partners do that today for us, and we were looking at enabling partners to do that in the future. The trick is the password restrictions. The fact that the password on-premise can be so much more, significantly richer than it can be in the cloud. We've got to sort of overcome that hurdle. So we're trying to work through that hurdle first. As we move to allowing partners to add support. All right. So, and some of the other changes are, well, if you're synchronizing your password, don't let them change it in the cloud. So you're right. It's a gap, if you will, between the sort of I can synchronize some of it and I can get to the top level. That sort of password sync option. But we will probably look towards partners to provide the password sync. But we've got a few problems to solve first. Not currently available, I should probably say. With what, sorry? Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yes, so really what's happening with that is all of this is all based on, sort of URLs, all right? So I'm just following a website through. So yes, you can stick a web proxy in front of me, and I will, happily suffer through NAT and other NAT, PAT, any other translations that you happen to have. So it's not. It's just a web protocol. All right. It's no more fancy than that. Everyone asks that question. When will it support IPv6? That's a good question, and I really don't have an answer for you. There's a number of moving parts that have to support IP. IPv6. We should talk about that one offline. I don't know of a plan. I don't know of a plan to support IPv6. It's a big work item outside of just identity. It's all the federated services have to do it. So it is a big work item. It is something that we've had a number of requests for. We just have to crawl before we run, I guess. So I'd be interested in what the scenario is around IPv6, but okay. Any other questions while we're here? We got 4 minutes before my little red light comes on. No? Can hosting providers federate? We should talk about that further, but the answer to that is yes and no. All right. Could I be grayer? The reason I say that is the reason I say yes and no is there's nothing stopping you. If you have AD on premise or AD, we don't know how it's configured. All we know is that when you synchronize it to the cloud, everything goes across to the cloud. The problem is that this immutable ID, so when DirSync kicks in, and this is why DirSync is really important, it synchronizes and it creates that user and it sets this immutable ID, this source user ID. When it sets that in the identity platform, when you hit the ADFS server, it must send exactly the same key. All right? If it doesn't, we don't do that map. Okay? So if you have a hosting provider and you've got sort of a multi-tenanted AD, we don't support your ability to sync individual parts of AD to different tenants. Problem number one. The second problem is that we need to make sure that these things all line up, that you can't, if you have a customization or a rule that says, oh, I'm not going to use AD object GUID, I'm going to use some other value because that's easy for me to manage. You've got to make sure that all of the I's and all the T's cross so that they match up perfectly. Case sensitivity is important. We are case sensitive on that immutable ID. All right? If those things don't line up, the users will get funny error messages and effectively not access to any service. Okay? So, apart from the fact that we can't sync, and yes, we could have an ADFS server support multiple UPN suffixes, we kind of get to this problem where the two are very tightly coupled. All right? Two different products, very tightly coupled. It's a little bit of a challenge for us. Okay? Anything else? All right, I'll probably let us go then, and I'll stand down the side here, and we'll answer any questions that you have.